Hello everybody, welcome back to the 51 Yarns Spin Along. This is week 34, which is the gradient week. My name is Bex from the Tiny Fibre Studio podcast, and this is a series of videos that I'm doing which coincide with Ply Magazine's 51 Yarns Spin Along. The idea of which is to spin along with the particular topic for that week, post a picture on Facebook, Ravelry or Instagram with the relevant hashtags, which I'll put in the description below, and you have the chance to win a year's subscription to Ply Magazine, which is very cool. Disclaimer, I am not affiliated with Ply Magazine in any way, shape or form, just use it as a resource. The eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed that it has been quite a few weeks since I last recorded an episode of this series. Apologies, that's partially because I've just been very busy and a little bit under the weather, but also that there were quite a few weeks recently where I just didn't have the fibre available to be able to do that topic justice, and so I decided to catch up with those at a later date when I do have that kind of fibre available, rather than do a half-hearted job and then have to, delete that video and upload something else later on. On with the topic of gradients. As far as I'm concerned, a gradient is a colour transition that happens over a long strip of fibre. I've got some examples to show you and you will see what I mean by that, but essentially for me it's something that is very, very gradual and doesn't bear any resemblance of self-striping yarn. Because this is an episode which is primarily about colour and colour management, there aren't going to be any demonstrations per se in this. I have a little bit of footage from something that I've been spinning this week. But this is less about demonstration, more about talking about how to manage colour and also different types of structure that you might want your yarn to have. First things first, in order to actually get a gradient, we need to have gradient of fibre in some way, shape or form. Possibly the easiest option there is to just buy some that some incredibly talented hand dyer has already dyed for us. That is a fantastic way to be able to support any local hand dyers that you have who dye fibre. And that's actually what I did with this one here, which I just finished spinning. Literally just finished it this morning, so it has not actually been soaked yet, but it has been spun. So this is from Hilltop Cloud, who's a dyer called Katie. She's from Wales, and I've spun a lot of her stuff before. I haven't actually spun one of her gradients before, so this was a new experience for me. And she did this update the other week and this one was in it and I thought it was fab. So it goes from pink through pinky grey to a grey in the middle and then into a dark grey on the end. And it looks fabulous. I spun this as a singles, but we'll talk more about the actual structure of a yarn later on. So that's one method, just go and buy some fabulously dyed gradient from an indie dyer. If you're into the idea of dyeing a gradient for yourself, there are various different ways that you can do that. One option, which I've done before, is to start with 2 different colours of strong dye. So whatever your normal proportion of dye powder to water is, go with that. But then you do little strips and then you gradually desaturate the colour by adding in more water. So essentially you keep watering it down until you're pretty much down to the natural colour of the fibre, and then you do the same from the opposite end. That does leave you with a neutral colour in the middle, which will be the natural colour of the fibre, but you could equally do it by adding in a certain percentage of the other colour with each strip until you're able to graduate out to the other colour. The other option, if you're not particularly into the idea of using a dyed fibre, is that if you have solid coloured fibres, you could use blending techniques to be able to get a gradient out of it. So for example, if you had 100 grams of blue and 100 grams of yellow and you wanted to create a gradient out of that, so your first strip might be 10 grams of just solid blue, but then you might do 9 grams of solid blue and 1 gram of yellow. And then 8 grams of solid blue and 2 grams of yellow, or whatever proportions you choose. And then you can either blend those with combs or hand cards, or some people are really clever and can just kind of hold them together and make it work. I've tried that. I would prefer to blend it if I could. So that's 3 options for actually getting the colour. Either buy it, hand dye it, or blend it in some way. The second major decision is how you're actually going to structure the yarn. So do you want it to be a singles, or do you want it to be plied? If you want it to be plied, how many plies, and so on. A lot depends on the fibre for this. For example, the Hilltop Cloud one that I showed you earlier on, the reason that I chose to do this as a singles is because it's partially sari silk. And sari silk, if you haven't spun it before, does have a bit of a tendency to come out in clumps. So this was never going to be the most consistent fibre in the universe. That might have led me to plying it. However, in this particular case, I felt like if I'd plied it, I would have ended up with a chunkier yarn than I really wanted. And that was why I chose to just leave it as a singles. But then we have something like this. So this is a little bit squished and compacted at the moment because it's just come out of storage. But this is one that I hand dyed the fibre for myself. And you can see it goes through from purple to grey to turquoise. I spun this one as a 2-ply. And it's actually, considering that this was a relatively early yarn, I think, it's come out actually pretty consistently. I'm quite happy with how it came out. This particular one was done by stripping the fibre into 2 pieces as equally as possible, and then just spinning each of them separately and plying them together. Because this is such a long gradient, there really aren't any areas where you can see a definite section where one colour meets another. They're just all kind of in the same tonal range. But there are 1 or 2 very little areas, like there's a strand just here where it's kind of purple and turquoise together. But once that's knitted up, you're barely going to see it. So I did a similar thing with this next yarn, but this was from bats. And the bats are weighed the same, and they all graduated from one colour to another across the bats. So what I did with each bat was to strip them in a Z shape. So if you have a bat, you strip it along one way, but then don't go right to the end of the bat. So you just leave yourself a little gap and then come back the other way. So I did that for each of them, and then just spun the lightest end first and worked round to the darkest end, and then plied the 3 of them together. And this is probably my favourite yarn that I've ever spun, just in terms of how pretty the fibre itself looks. You know, the yarn just looks really, really pretty on its own, and I could quite happily just put this in a little display case and just look at it forever. But this is from, as I say, 3 bats from Nonoko, who sadly no longer exist. But if you're looking for something similar, Candy, who was one of the originators of Nonoko, she now sells under the name of Spin Jones. So if you're looking for kind of similar quality of stuff, then this is one of them. So there were 3 bats, 3 different colourways, but they all graduated in the same way. So they all went from light to dark. So I was able to create this kind of gradient yarn, but it's a very subtle gradient, just from a sort of light green to a dark green. The other method that may well be attractive for a lot of people is chain plying. I feel like chain plying is less necessary with a gradient than it is for something like a self-striping yarn. If I was trying to do self-striping, I would almost certainly choose to chain ply. But for a gradient, I feel like you have a little bit more leeway because there's less chance of the colours kind of mixing up. So I would say just pick your favourite structure of yarn and try spinning a gradient using that method. So there we go, that is all of the gradients. And I do think that gradients are a fantastic way for people to take their first steps in thinking about colour management in spinning. So if you've been a little bit cautious of colour before, then maybe grab some gradient fibre and just grab it and spin it how you want, because it will pretty much always come out looking amazing. In between now and next week, you can find me on Instagram as Tiny Fibre Studio and on Ravelry, I'm Ibex. I hope this was useful and I will see you again next time.